Ukrainian officials have cheered apparent attacks on military bases in Russian-annexed Crimea and warned civilians to stay away from potential targets, shortly after Moscow on Tuesday said the explosions were the result of sabotage. Russian-installed officials have accused Ukrainian forces of shelling the city of Enerhoda, where the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant is located, according to Interfax news agency, while Ukraine blamed Russia for shelling the city of Nikopol, across the Dnieper River.
This story contains descriptions of suicide. If you or a loved one is experiencing suicidal thoughts, help and support are available. Visit Befrienders International for more information about support services. Idlib, Syria. Mohammed Anjouki had lived the majority of his 16 years during Syria's devastating war. The largely opposition-held province in the country's northwest, he had survived the direct consequences of the war, the airstrikes, the barrel bombs, the snipers. But the war has other effects, and Mohammed's family was finding it hard to get by. His father had his legs amputated as a result of injuries sustained during the war, and the family had been forced to flee their home in the town of Marat al-Numan after government forces attacked in 2019, and settled in camps for internally displaced people along the Syrian-Turkish border. Mohammed dropped out of school, and started to look for a job to help them. Mohammed had to bear the responsibility of providing for the whole family, his father, Salim, explained to Al Jazeera. He had 9 siblings, 7 of them girls, and he was the eldest of the boys. He left school and worked full-time, something he wasn't used to. We had no idea where we were going when we left Marat al-Numan. We spent our first night sleeping in the open in the rain. We went from place to place fleeing the regime forces, he added, speaking of the trauma that the whole family had experienced. Salim said that his son would tell those around him their circumstances would improve, and that the family would be able to return to Marat al-Numan. But at the same time, Mohammed was getting into debt trying to help his family, and it was gradually affecting him. His behavior was changing, he would sit alone away from the family, and he appeared to be under pressure, Salim said. I would find him alone sitting outside after midnight. Mohammed would take his own life in his tent shortly after the Eid holiday, in April. Mohammed would take his own life in his tent shortly after the Eid holiday, in April. According to the Response Coordination Group, a Syrian NGO working in the northwest of the country, suicides are on the rise in the region, from 22 in 2021, to at least 32 in the first 6 months of 2022. Ahmed Abdul Hay, a psychotherapist working with the SAMS Medical Center in Idlib, told Al Jazeera that the trauma that many Syrians have experienced may be a reason for the increased number of suicides. People in northern Syria face conditions such as displacement, losing their homes, living in camps where they lose their privacy, as well as unemployment, poverty and an inability to adapt to the difficult conditions, Abdul Hay said. This then leads to people losing hope and fearing the future, which appears as if it were getting worse. Approximately 90% of Syrians live under the poverty line, according to the United Nations, leaving many Syrian breadwinners unable to provide for their families. The absence of a support system to help deal with these problems is one of the main reasons for the increase in suicides, said Abdul Hay. In most of the cases recorded, warnings had been given before suicides were carried out, but the threats were not taken seriously, and vulnerable people were instead reprimanded by family members or met with indifference, he said. Most of the suicides carried out have been by young people, many of whom have lost hope after living for such a large proportion of their lives during war. Young Syrians see on the internet and in films people living lives completely different to their own, said Abdullah Darwish, a local researcher. This often makes them feel secluded and makes them think negative thoughts about their unknown future. Darwish also believes that an improved economic environment would help to alleviate the growing trend. Quote, there need to be more job opportunities, particularly for young people, so that they go from being consumers to producers, even if it's just small projects, Darwish said. This will make them more positive about life. While the majority of the suicide cases recorded were men, Abdul Hay explained that this may not actually be true. This is a conservative society where psychological illness is still regarded as shameful, and where people avoid visiting psychiatrists, let alone suicides, said Abdul Hay. I think that the number of women who have committed suicide is likely to be higher, but that relatives do not talk publicly about it, and say the death was caused by something else. There should be more awareness of the rise in suicidal thoughts, Abdul Hay added. Mental illness should be regarded as a disease that should be treated by health professionals, and not be covered up and thought of as shameful.
Turkey and Israel have agreed to restore full diplomatic relations and will return ambassadors to each other's countries following a gradual improvement in relations, the two countries have said. Upgrading relations will contribute to deepening ties between the two peoples, expanding economic, trade, and cultural ties, and strengthening regional stability, a statement from the office of the Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid said on Wednesday, after a conversation between Lapid and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Appointment of ambassadors was one of the steps for the normalization of ties, said Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu at a news conference in Ankara. Such a positive step came from Israel as a result of these efforts, and as Turkey, we also decided to appoint an ambassador to Israel, to Tel Aviv. Cavusoglu added that the move did not mean that Turkey would be abandoning the Palestinian cause. The two countries expelled ambassadors in 2018 over the killing of 60 Palestinians by Israeli forces during protests on the Gaza border against the opening of the United States Embassy in Jerusalem. A visit to Turkey by Israeli President Isaac Herzog in March, followed by visits by both foreign ministers, helped warm relations after more than 10 years of tensions. The move, which comes as Israel has sought to improve ties with regional powers, was agreed upon 2 years after the so-called Abraham Accords, which saw relations normalized between Israel, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates and Morocco.
Iran is ready to swap prisoners with the United States, its foreign ministry spokesman was quoted as saying, calling on President Joe Biden's administration to act instead of performing theatrical shows. Tehran has sought the release of over a dozen Iranians in the United States, including 7 Iranian-American dual nationals, 2 Iranians with permanent U.S. residency and 4 Iranian citizens with no legal status in the United States. We are ready to swap prisoners with Washington. The U.S. must release jailed Iranian citizens without any conditions, the semi-official Fars news agency quoted Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani as saying on Wednesday. On Tuesday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken tweeted that Siamak Namazi had now spent 2,500 days, wrongfully detained, in Iran, and Washington was determined to secure the freedom of all Americans held by its Middle East adversary. Kanani's remarks came as Tehran and Washington tried to revive a 2015 nuclear pact after lengthy negotiations. The European Union and United States said on Tuesday they were studying Iran's response to what the EU has called its final proposal to save the deal, after Tehran called on Washington to show flexibility.
UN Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet has said it remains unsafe for Rohingya refugees to return to their homes in Myanmar, nearly 5 years after a crackdown there sparked an exodus to neighboring Bangladesh. Nearly 1 million members of the mostly Muslim minority now live in a sprawling and squalid patchwork of refugee settlements near Bangladesh's southern coast. Bachelet met with Rohingya community members during a tour of the camps on Tuesday and said they had expressed resounding hope that they would be able to go back to their homes. Unfortunately, the current situation across the border means that the conditions are not right for returns, Bachelet told reporters in the Bangladeshi capital of Dhaka on Wednesday. Repatriation must always be conducted in a voluntary and dignified manner, only when safe and sustainable conditions exist in Myanmar. Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina told Bachelet that Rohingya refugees living in overcrowded camps in Bangladesh must return home to Myanmar. The Rohingya are nationals of Myanmar and they have to be taken back, Hasina was quoted as saying by her press secretary, Ihsanul Karim on Wednesday. Most of the refugees fled their homes after a 2017 Myanmar army offensive that is now subject to a landmark genocide case at the UN's top court. 5 years on, the refugees refuse to go back without guarantees for their safety and rights in Myanmar, which is now ruled by a military junta after the ouster of its civilian government last year.
Be aware. With the world. APN Broadcast Service.